A forgotten soldier sat alone in his cabin for 12 long years, paralyzed not just in body, but in hope. Doctors had told him he'd never walk again, and worse, he believed them. Until one winter morning, a wounded German shepherd limped up his porch, stared straight into his soul, and refused to leave. No bark, no begging, just silent understanding. This wasn't just a stray. This was a former canine, abandoned, broken, and yet still fighting. What happened next between a man who'd given up and a dog who hadn't will make you cry and believe in second chances again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far their story travels, and if you believe no soldier, human, or canine should ever be forgotten. Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness may just restore your faith in healing. The wind rolled low over the hills of Missoula, Montana, tugging at the dry pines and sending flakes of old snow dancing across the dirt path. It was mid-March, that strange in-between season where the cold hadn't fully let go and spring hadn't quite begun. The morning air was crisp, still holding winter's breath. In a faded, weather-worn log cabin on the edge of the Bitterroot Forest, a man sat motionless by the window. His name was Luke Morgan. Once a proud Marine in peak condition, Luke had once stood at 6 feet tall with broad shoulders, a square jaw, and ocean-gray eyes that seemed to hold both command and kindness. But now, at 42, his frame had hollowed. His once muscular build had softened from years in a wheelchair. His dark brown hair had grown long, unkempt, tucked beneath a wool cap. His beard was patchy, untamed. Luke hadn't walked since the IED struck his convoy during his final tour in Afghanistan, an explosion that shattered not just his spine, but something deeper inside. The medics had saved his life, but no doctor could repair the post-traumatic stress disorder that haunted him. He didn't speak to neighbors. He didn't go into town. His world had shrunk to 4 walls and silence. He barely slept. Each night was a battlefield of its own. Memories of gunfire, screams, a friend named Ramirez who didn't make it. Most mornings Luke awoke covered in sweat, gripping the arms of his chair as if bracing for impact. His only contact with the outside world came through a middle-aged woman named Sarah Blake, who dropped off groceries once a week. Sarah had kind eyes and a straightforward manner. She was tall, lean, always in jeans and a flannel shirt. Her husband had died in the same war Luke had served in, and since then, she'd taken up helping veterans around the area. It was her quiet way of making peace with the past. That Thursday morning, Sarah's pickup truck crunched up the gravel drive as usual. But instead of a box of canned goods or another folded flyer from the VA, she stepped out with something unexpected in the back seat, a dog crate. Luke squinted at it through the window, his brows pinched. Sarah knocked on the door and waited. She didn't expect Luke to open. He never did. So she called out gently, "Luke, I brought someone who might be good company." He didn't reply, but she knew he was listening. He always was. She walked around to the passenger side and opened the crate. A large German shepherd stepped out with a limp. The dog's coat was matted in places, the fur around his left hind leg shaved and scarred. One ear was half folded, likely from an old injury, and there was a faded military tag still dangling from his collar, Ranger. The dog didn't bark, didn't sniff or bolt or whimper. He simply looked up at Sarah, then turned his head slowly toward the cabin and walked. 3 slow, uneven steps up the porch. Luke watched, frozen. Ranger limped to the screen door, looked through the mesh, and sat. Not pawing, not whining, just waiting. A full minute passed. Then Luke reached over and unlocked the door with a loud click. Sarah turned, startled. It was the first sound she'd heard from him in over a year. The door creaked open just a crack. Ranger didn't hesitate. He nudged it with his nose gently, and entered like he had always belonged. Luke didn't speak. Ranger didn't ask him to. The dog made his way slowly across the wooden floor and sat at Luke's side. Then, almost reverently, He laid his head on Luke's knee and closed his eyes. Luke looked down, his hand hovering in the air, unsure. Then, slowly, he let it drop. His fingers brushed Ranger's fur. Warm, rough, real. Luke closed his eyes. For a moment, his breathing evened. No words, no salutes, no orders. Just wait. Connection. Sarah didn't say anything. She quietly walked back to her truck, eyes brimming, and drove away. Inside the cabin, Luke and Ranger sat in silence. Two broken soldiers who didn't need fixing, just understanding. And for the first time in 12 years, Luke didn't wake up from a nightmare that night. The morning after Ranger arrived, Luke Morgan found himself awake before sunrise, staring at the wooden beams of his ceiling, unusually still. No nightmares, no racing heart, just the sound of Ranger's breathing at the foot of his bed, a rhythmic, grounded presence. Ranger had chosen to sleep right beside Luke's wheelchair, his injured legs stretched slightly awkward, but his body curled protectively around the space. When Luke finally shifted to sit up, the dog stirred, lifted his head, and stared at him, alert but not demanding. Luke wasn't sure what to make of it. He hadn't agreed to keep the dog. Not really. Sarah had left without a word, leaving Ranger as if it had all been settled. But then again, Luke hadn't told her to take the dog back either. After a quick, awkward moment of brushing his hair and pulling on a flannel shirt that had seen better days, Luke wheeled himself to the kitchen. He poured kibble into an old soup bowl he found under the sink. He placed it on the floor, expecting Ranger to rush over. Instead, the dog simply walked over with solemn grace, sniffed once, and began to eat. No wagging, no excitement, just quiet focus. It was that quiet that unnerved Luke most. By late morning, Sarah came back. She knocked, waited, and when Luke didn't respond, she opened the door with her usual calm. Tall and wiry, Sarah Blake moved like someone used to holding heavy things. Grief, for example. She was in her early 50s, sun-weathered skin, long gray-streaked hair tied in a braid over one shoulder, and a pair of steel blue eyes that missed nothing. She didn't speak much, but when she did, every word was meant. "You fed him?" she asked, gently placing a bag of supplies on the counter. Luke gave a short nod. Ranger padded up behind him and sat at his side, as if answering for him. Sarah smiled faintly. He doesn't usually let anyone near him. At the shelter, they had to feed him through the gate. Wouldn't even look at the staff. Luke didn't know how to respond to that. He looked down at Ranger, who now leaned subtly into the side of his chair. "What happened to him?" Luke asked, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah hesitated, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "His name's Ranger. Military dog, trained for tactical rescue. He and his handler, a kid named Corporal Riley Owens, were deployed 3 tours together. 3rd tour, hostage extraction in Kandahar. RPG took out half the unit. Ranger dragged 2 soldiers out of the rubble." Luke blinked slowly. "The handler? Didn't make it?" Sarah's voice grew quiet. "Ranger didn't leave his side for 2 days. When they tried to separate them, he attacked one of the medics." Luke swallowed. Something inside his chest twisted. He glanced at Ranger, who now rested his chin on the wheel of the chair, unmoving. "They retired him after that," Sarah continued. "Filed him under too unstable for reassignment, but he kept waiting. Every time the door opened at the base, they said, he'd perk up, like he thought Riley was coming back." A long silence followed. Luke finally murmured, "Why bring him here?" Sarah placed the mug on the table and looked at him directly. "Because he doesn't listen to anyone, doesn't trust anyone, except you, and maybe that's not an accident." She left without pressing further. Ranger stayed. That night, the cabin was still. A storm rolled in around 2 a.m. Not thunder, just wind, long gusts shaking the trees. Luke woke with a start, breath ragged, body drenched in sweat. In his dream, he'd been crawling through fire again. The same night Ramirez screamed and didn't stop. He gasped, shaking, gripping the blanket, unable to focus. Then he felt it. A warm pressure on his chest, a soft lick across his cheek. Not aggressive, not sloppy. Just grounding. Ranger had jumped onto the bed. He wasn't supposed to. But there he was, head buried against Luke's chest, tail still, heart thudding in sync with Luke's. Luke didn't speak. He simply exhaled, a long, shuddering release, and let his fingers rest on Ranger's back. Minutes passed. The breathing steadied. The memory drifted, not gone, but no longer holding him hostage. It was the first time in over a decade that Luke felt something he couldn't name. Not safety exactly, but the closest thing to it. He whispered, "Good dog," before drifting off again, his hand still on Ranger's back. The days that followed bled into one another with the slow rhythm of thawing snow and creaking pine trees. Missoula was beginning its subtle shift into spring. The icicles that clung to Luke Morgan's porch now dripped steadily under the gentle gaze of a sun that, for the first time in months, seemed less distant. It was quiet, yes, but no longer empty. Luke had started taking Ranger outside, not far, just to the edge of the woods that bordered the back of his cabin. At first, it was more necessity than choice. Ranger wouldn't relieve himself indoors, and Luke respected that discipline. But the moment Luke wheeled down the small gravel path and felt the filtered sunlight touching his skin, something stirred. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The forest line was only 50 feet from his back porch, yet Luke hadn't gone there in years. Trees stood tall like silent sentinels, their branches swaying lazily in the breeze. Ranger would stop now and then, nose lifted into the air, ears twitching to invisible frequencies. There was a calmness about the dog when he was outside, like being under the open sky reminded him of who he used to be. Luke noticed it too. By the third morning, Luke started rolling farther past the first tree line, his fingers brushing against the old bark of a white pine. He didn't like to admit it aloud, but Ranger wasn't just leading him out, he was pulling him back in. It was on the 5th day of their walks that they met the boy. Luke had wheeled up to the clearing where the trees gave way to a small slope overlooking the creek. Ranger was ahead, tail relaxed, sniffing the underbrush. That's when a voice rang out from behind a fallen log. "Hey, doggy, what's your name?" Ranger froze, ears perked, then wagged his tail twice and trotted toward the voice. Luke narrowed his eyes as a boy, no older than 9, popped his head over the log. The child had a mop of sandy brown curls, an oversized hoodie stained with paint, and a pair of thin legs in muddied jeans. His nose was dusted with freckles, and his eyes, hazel and curious, lit up when Ranger approached. The boy reached out with caution, letting Ranger sniff his hand. Ranger gave a small grunt of approval and nudged his head into the boy's palm. "You're not scared, huh?" the boy said, smiling as he sat cross-legged on the grass. "Most dogs don't like me right away." Luke approached slowly, unsure of how to interrupt. The boy looked up. "Is he yours?" Luke gave a short nod. "Kind of. We're figuring that out." The boy grinned. "Cool. I'm Ben. I live with my grandma in the greenhouse down the hill. She lets me come play out here after school. Said it keeps me from blowing up the microwave again." Luke raised an eyebrow. "Again?" Ben shrugged with mock innocence. "Left a fork in my soup once. Just once." There was something easy about the boy's energy, unfiltered, unjudging. He didn't seem put off by Luke's chair or silence. If anything, he seemed more interested in Ranger, who was now lying beside Ben, head on his lap. "I think he likes me," Ben said, stroking Ranger's fur. Luke nodded. "He doesn't do that with just anyone." "He used to be in the army?" Ben asked, his tone shifting into awe. "Grandma said she saw your dog on the news once. She said he saved people." Luke hesitated, unsure of what to share. "Yeah, he was a good soldier." Ben looked up. "Like you?" Luke blinked. No one had called him that in years. He gave the smallest nod. "Grandma says soldiers are like superheroes," Ben continued, scratching behind Ranger's ear. "But they're not in comics, so most people forget them. That's why I draw them." Luke noticed the sketch pad at Ben's feet, half covered in dried leaves. "You draw?" Ben opened the pad and flipped through several pages crude pencil sketches of forest animals, a few stick-figure action scenes, and then, surprisingly, a remarkably accurate outline of a soldier in uniform standing next to a big dog with pointed ears. Luke recognized the stance immediately. It was his, and Ranger's. "You drew this?" Luke asked, voice softer now. Ben nodded. "Saw you from the hill a couple days ago. Didn't know if I should say hi." Luke looked down at the drawing again, something warm tugging at his chest. "You should keep drawing," he said. Ben smiled, wide and unfiltered. "Can I draw him more? Like, maybe tomorrow?" Luke hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Yeah, I think he'd like that." As the sun dipped lower behind the trees, casting long amber shadows across the clearing, Ben picked up his sketch pad, patted Ranger on the head, and started down the hill. "See you, Ranger. See you, Mr. Soldier Guy." Luke watched him go, feeling a strange new weight, not heavy, but present. Back in the cabin that night, Luke sat longer by the window. Ranger lay beside him, breathing slow. Luke's hand absent-mindedly scratched behind his ear. "You made a friend today," he murmured. Ranger blinked slowly, then let out a low sigh and pressed closer. Luke hadn't been part of anything in years. But today, for the first time, he wasn't just surviving the day. He'd participated in it. It had rained the night before, leaving the forest floor soft and fragrant with pine needles and wet earth. The air was crisp, tinted with the scent of cedar and the hush of distant winds. Luke had been feeling better that morning, more confident, less cautious. For the first time in years, he told himself to push just a bit farther. He left the gravel trail behind his cabin and followed an old logging path through the deeper woods. Ranger padded along beside him, tongue lolling, gait steady despite the faint hitch in his back leg. His ears swiveled at every sound, scanning the woods the way he must have done in deployment alert, but relaxed. Luke guided his wheelchair slowly, its tires crunching damp twigs. The trees grew thicker, taller, cutting off most of the light, but Luke didn't mind. He liked the quiet here. He liked how the world felt muffled, as if someone had turned the volume down. About 45 minutes in, they reached a clearing Luke hadn't seen since before the injury. A rocky bluff overlooking a low creek that shimmered through the trees. It was peaceful. Still. Luke set the brakes on his chair and inhaled deeply. Ranger sat at his side, silent sentinel. Then it happened. A rustle in the trees. Harmless, ordinary ignited something visceral. Luke's breath hitched. His grip on the armrests tightened. The moment shattered. He saw the desert, the dust, a burning Humvee, screams that cracked the sky. His chest collapsed inward. He gasped, eyes wide. The trees began spinning. The clearing darkened. He heard Ramirez yelling again. No, not yelling. Screaming, but no words. Just sound and blood and dust. The wheelchair pitched forward. Luke tried to stabilize, but his muscles betrayed him. He collapsed sideways, striking the wet earth with a dull thud. His body curled in on itself, a wounded instinct. His eyes rolled back. Then everything went black. Ranger immediately stepped over him, nudging his face with his snout, whining. When Luke didn't respond, the dog barked short, urgent. Once, twice. Then silence. No one else was nearby. No other sound but the wind through the pines. Ranger stared toward the trail they had come from. His ears twitched. Then, instinct overriding everything else, he turned and ran. The limp in his gait made him awkward, but he was fast. Driven. The leash attached to his harness flapped behind him, catching on brambles, but he tore through anyway. Back down the ridge, across the narrow footbridge, through the thinning trees. He ran toward the town's edge. Near the last bend of the trail, Gloria Tisdale, a woman in her mid-60s with a round figure and silver curls tucked into a knit cap, was collecting wild herbs along the edge with her grandson, Eli, a quiet 10-year-old with big wireframe glasses and a sketch pad tucked under one arm. Ranger appeared suddenly, muddy and panting. Gloria stepped back in surprise as he skidded to a halt and began barking. Short, sharp, deliberate. "Isn't that Mr. Morgan's dog?" Eli asked, crouching. Gloria narrowed her eyes. "I believe it is." Ranger turned, barked again and darted a few steps up the trail, then looked back. "He wants us to follow," Eli said. Gloria didn't hesitate. She fished out her phone, dialed her son. "Dean," she said, "get your truck. Luke's dog just showed up alone and something's wrong." Dean Tisdale arrived in 10 minutes, tall and lean, early 40s, a former infantryman with a square jaw and worn flannel jacket. He jumped out of the truck, opened the back door, and motioned to Ranger. "Show me." Ranger led. They followed him deep into the forest, Gloria and Eli trailing behind. Ranger didn't stop to sniff or slow. He knew the way. He had memorized it. Finally, in the clearing, they found Luke unmoving. Sprawled in the mud, his wheelchair tipped on its side, one hand curled into a fist. Dean rushed forward, crouching beside him. "He's breathing," he said, checking vitals. "Weak, but steady." Ranger hovered close, whining. "All right," Dean grunted. "Let's get him out of here." They righted the wheelchair, laid Luke gently against it, then secured him in the truck. Gloria covered him with an old quilt from the back seat. Dean slammed the door and turned the truck towards town. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat, resting his head on Luke's leg as they drove. 20 minutes later, they pulled into Missoula General Hospital, a modest facility with brick walls and a blue emergency entrance. Nurses rushed out with a stretcher. Dean gave a quick, clear summary. Ranger tried to follow, but the nurses hesitated. "Let him in," Dean said firmly. "He's the one who found him." They let Ranger trail behind the gurney as Luke was wheeled through the sliding doors. In the hallway, the fluorescent lights hummed. Doctors barked orders. An oxygen mask was fitted, IVs connected. A nurse clipped an ID band to Luke's wrist. Through it all, Ranger stood just outside the trauma room door, unmoving, watching through the glass. Inside, Luke still hadn't opened his eyes. The light in the hospital was sharp, sterile, and far too white. It slipped through the half-closed blinds and washed over the room like a cold blanket. Luke blinked against it, waking slowly to the mechanical hum of a monitor and the soft beeping beside his ear. His body ached, not just from the fall in the woods, but from the fatigue that seemed to settle deep in his bones. He wasn't at home. The window overlooked a parking lot bordered by pine trees and, beyond that, the mountains, a jagged silhouette against the sky. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and sun-warmed linen. The rhythm of the room was calm, almost indifferent, until a soft whine reached his ear. Ranger. The dog was lying beside the bed, curled up against the wall, leash still attached to the lower frame. His eyes opened the moment Luke stirred, his head lifting just enough to confirm Luke was awake before lowering again in quiet reassurance. There was a knock. The door opened. A woman entered, her white coat trailing slightly behind her. She was in her early 30s, average height, with olive skin and sharp cheekbones softened by warm brown eyes. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat twist, and a stethoscope hung loosely around her neck. She carried a clipboard in one hand and a mug in the other. "Mr. Morgan," she said, voice clear but gentle, "you gave the forest a bit of a scare." Luke tried to sit up but winced. His limbs felt heavy, stiff. "Where?" "Community hospital," she replied, "just outside Missoula. You've been out almost 20 hours. Mild dehydration, minor concussion. But you're stable." Luke glanced toward Ranger, then back at her. She followed his gaze and smiled. "That one refused to leave your side. Gave our staff quite the hard time. We finally had to clear him for emotional support status just to let him stay in the room." Luke's lips curved slightly, almost a smile. "Smart move." She moved closer, pulling up a stool beside the bed. "I'm Dr. Olivia Hart. I'll be handling your recovery protocol from here." Olivia had a calm presence about her, not distant like many physicians, but not overly familiar either. There was something deliberate in the way she spoke, as if she weighed each word for its ability to comfort or wound. Her voice didn't carry sympathy. It carried respect. "I've read your VA file," she continued. "Marine Corps, medically discharged, spinal trauma, PTSD, and a history of refusing physical therapy. Luke gave a one-shoulder shrug. Didn't seem worth it. She nodded. I get that. Most of my patients feel the same at first. He studied her. You worked with veterans before? My late husband, she said simply, was Army Special Forces. He didn't make it back. After that, I left the civilian sector. Figured if I couldn't save him, I might at least help the ones who did come home. Luke didn't speak. There was nothing to say to that, but in that moment, something shifted. A quiet, mutual understanding passed between them. Look, Olivia said, placing the clipboard on the counter, we're not talking miracles. I'm not here to promise full mobility, but with targeted neurophysical rehab, we might regain standing control, maybe even assisted steps. The key is consistency. Luke looked toward the window. The light had shifted, less harsh now, filtered through a drifting cloud. What changed? She asked softly. He turned to her, puzzled. You've been refusing help for years. Now you let a dog drag you out into the woods, nearly kill yourself, and wake up in a hospital agreeing to see me. Luke looked at Ranger, who was now sitting upright, watching them both with calm intelligence. I didn't agree, he muttered. Not yet, she smirked. Fair enough, but let me show you something before you say no. That afternoon, with Ranger walking beside his chair, Luke was wheeled into the rehab wing of the hospital. It was a quiet, space-light green walls, large windows, rubberized floors. One side held stationary bikes and resistance machines. The other, a set of polished parallel bars, gleamed under the light. 30 seconds, Olivia said, tightening a support brace around his knees. That's all I want you to try. Just pressure bearing. Ranger will stay here. No cheering section, no crowd. Just you, me, and him. Luke hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the bars. Olivia moved behind him, not touching, but ready. You tell me when, she said. Luke inhaled deeply, grit his jaw, and nodded. Olivia braced his legs, gently supported his lower back. Now, shift forward. Let your arms take some weight. Good. Hold. The strain hit quickly. Muscles long unused screamed awake. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he kept going. Below, Ranger lay still, ears alert. His eyes never left Luke's face. 20 seconds, Olivia said. Almost there. Luke's arms shook. 10 more. His teeth clenched. Then she said, Sit. Luke collapsed into the chair, breath ragged, face flushed. He expected embarrassment. Instead, Ranger came forward, rested his chin gently on Luke's thigh. You just stood for 30 seconds, Mr. Morgan, Olivia said. That's more than you've done in 12 years. Luke let his head fall back and exhaled. Not relief, not pride, something quieter, something like permission. That night, back in his hospital room, the window was open just slightly. The sunset bathed the room in a warm orange hue. Ranger lay at Luke's feet. Olivia had left hours ago, but her words lingered. You're not finished, Luke. Not yet. The light in the hospital room had shifted from sterile white to something gentler, softened by the late afternoon sun that filtered through the blinds. Luke Morgan lay awake, propped against his pillows, his eyes fixed not on the ceiling or the window, but on Ranger, who sat quietly at the edge of his bed like a sentinel made of fur and patience. It had been 2 days since the incident in the woods. He'd awakened in a blur, tubes in his arms, a dull ache along his spine, and a memory like a shattered mirror. He couldn't piece it all together, but he remembered falling. He remembered the fear swallowing him whole. And then he remembered Ranger, that last tether between his breath and the earth. Now he was awake, alert, and exhausted in a way he hadn't felt since deployment. And someone was knocking. The door opened before he could answer. Dr. Olivia Hart entered, carrying a tablet and wearing the same clean-cut white coat she had the day before. Her hair was tied up again, loose wisps framing a face that had long learned to hide sorrow behind professionalism. She moved with quiet confidence, each step measured but unhurried. "Morning, Marine," she greeted, not with cheerfulness, but respect. Your vitals are stable. The labs look clean. You're not going anywhere yet, but today we try something new. Luke raised an eyebrow. I haven't even been out of bed yet. You won't be walking laps? Not yet. She set the tablet on a tray and pulled the blinds open halfway. But we're starting with stand therapy. 30 seconds, that's all. He blinked. That's all. Olivia turned to face him. 30 seconds is a lot more than nothing. Luke hesitated, then looked to Ranger, who tilted his head in quiet agreement. They transferred him to the rehab wing just before noon. The room had wide windows, pale green walls, and a long mirror along one side that Luke tried not to look at. The center featured 2 sturdy parallel bars, gleaming slightly under the warm ceiling light. It was quiet, just Olivia, an assistant therapist named Monique, and Ranger, who padded in and lay down just beyond the bars, eyes sharp and watching. Monique, a stocky woman in her 50s with soft eyes and calloused hands, adjusted the braces on Luke's knees with methodical precision. Her voice was calm, her hands steady. Clearly, someone who had spent years helping people do what their bodies had forgotten. Luke gritted his teeth as the support braces clicked into place. We'll help you up, Olivia said. You'll take weight mostly with your arms, but the goal is to let your legs feel it, even just a little. Luke gave a single nod. Monique moved to one side. Olivia took the other. They counted to 3, and slowly, agonizingly lifted him until he gripped the bars with both hands, his elbows trembling. The first 5 seconds were all breath. Then came the burn. His quads trembled. His calves ached. Sweat beaded on his brow. Every nerve felt like it was screaming at once. And then he felt it. The soft brush of fur. Ranger had risen silently and stood beside him, pressing gently against Luke's leg, just enough to feel. The dog's head reached Luke's knee, and for a moment he pressed his snout against Luke's outer thigh, stabilizing him in a way no machine ever could. Luke's breath caught, his jaw clenched tighter. 15 seconds, Olivia said softly. Halfway. Luke stared down at the floor. His arms shook. His legs felt like wet rope. Ranger didn't move. 25. Luke's vision began to blur. 30. Okay, sit. He collapsed into the chair, heart pounding, soaked in sweat. He could barely feel his fingers, but he'd done it. He'd stood. Olivia knelt beside him. You held for the full count. That's a victory, Luke. He didn't say anything. He couldn't, but Ranger did, just a soft, muffled grunt and a tail thump against the linoleum. Olivia stood, smiled faintly, and gave Ranger a gentle pat on the head. He kept you steady. That's his job now. Luke closed his eyes and nodded once, as if accepting an oath. Later that evening, while he rested back in his room, a nurse walked in with a small bundle of envelopes. These came for you. Luke frowned. For me? The nurse smiled. We don't get much mail here, but someone put up a note at the town library bulletin board. Word spreads fast. He opened the first envelope. It was a simple card with a watercolor painting of pine trees. Inside, a short note. You're braver than you think. We're rooting for you. Mrs. Halverson, from the bookstore. Another envelope held a folded page with crayon scribbles Ranger and Luke drawn in bright colors, standing side by side, both with capes. The note at the bottom read, From Ben. You look like a superhero now. Luke stared at the drawing for a long time. He hadn't realized anyone had been watching. Ranger climbed into his spot beside the bed and let out a long sigh. Luke reached down, fingers slipping through the dog's fur. I guess we're not invisible anymore, he murmured. The sun had dipped behind the trees, casting golden light through the window softer now, less harsh. Luke looked at the sky, then at his legs. They still didn't move, but now they remembered what it felt like. It had been exactly 4 weeks since Luke Morgan first stood on trembling legs for 30 seconds. 4 weeks of sweat, setbacks, and silence filled with steady effort. Now, the snow along the edge of Missoula had almost entirely melted. The mountain air still carried a chill, but wildflowers had begun to peek from the soil, and the wind felt less like resistance and more like reminder. Inside the hospital's rehab wing, the morning light poured in through wide windows, bathing the parallel bars in soft gold. Luke no longer used those bars, not today. He stood just a few feet away, a black aluminum cane in one hand, and Ranger on the other side, already alert, tail flicking slightly. The German shepherd's posture had changed over the weeks. The slight limp in his rear leg remained, but his frame had filled back out, muscles rebuilding, coat glossy and brushed. He wore no vest, no harness, just a simple collar and presence. Olivia Hart stood off to the side, arms crossed, a faint smile tucked at the corner of her lips. She no longer offered encouragement like a coach, but simply waited, confident, patient. "You ready?" she asked. Luke didn't answer. He just took a breath and shifted his weight. The first step was more of a shuffle, but it happened. The cane tapped the rubber floor, and Ranger immediately moved in sync, walking a half step beside Luke like a ghost of training past. Another step, then another. Luke's legs wobbled under the unfamiliar demand, but he didn't stop. One foot, then the other. He passed the point where the parallel bars ended. Olivia didn't count, Monique didn't cheer, and Ranger didn't bark. This wasn't a victory lap. This was a man reclaiming space. Inch by inch. By the fifth step, sweat clung to his temples. By the seventh, his grip on the cane tightened. But he didn't fall. When he reached the wall, he stopped, turned, and looked back. Olivia gave a single nod. Ranger sat, head tilted slightly, watching. "You," Luke said to the dog between breaths, "are still better at this than me." Ranger gave a soft grunt and leaned in as if to say, "Not the point." That afternoon, Luke sat outside for the first time since being admitted. The hospital had a small concrete courtyard with wooden benches and a flower bed still recovering from winter. He sat beneath the awning, cane resting beside him, Ranger lying at his feet. That's when Thomas Dyer walked up, an older man with a gentle limp, a faded Vietnam vet cap, and a denim jacket with patches worn from decades. He had kind eyes, roomy but alert, and moved with deliberate effort. "You're the Marine they're talking about," Thomas said, easing down onto the bench beside Luke. "The one with the dog who doesn't leave his side." Luke glanced over, the corners of his mouth twitching. "That's me, or maybe it's him, and I'm just the accessory." Thomas chuckled, then leaned back. "Name's Tom. We meet at the community center every Friday. Vets, all branches, nothing fancy. Coffee, stories, some truth, a little bull." He looked down at Ranger. "You should come by." Luke hadn't been in a room with other veterans in years. He used to avoid them, used to fear what their voices might echo in him, but now something in him stirred. He didn't answer immediately, but Tom nodded anyway, as if the question didn't need answering today. That Friday, Luke went. The community center sat on the edge of town, a squat beige building with a hand-painted mural of a bald eagle and waving flag on one wall. The inside smelled of old books and burnt coffee. There were about 10 people in the room, men mostly, a few women, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. No ranks, no speeches, just stories. Luke sat in the back at first. Ranger sat beside him, drawing more attention than Luke did. People smiled. Some waved. Tom introduced him quietly. "This is Luke." He brought his shadow with him. Ranger wagged once and then sat as if he had always belonged. At first, Luke listened. Stories of deployments long past, of friends lost and friends saved. Then someone asked him gently, "Where were you?" He hesitated. Then, with a slow exhale, Luke told the story, not the whole of it, but enough. About Kandahar, about the explosion, about Ramirez, about the silence afterward, years long and heavy. He didn't cry. No one did. But when he finished, Ranger leaned his head against Luke's leg again. One of the men, a former corpsman named Julian with a missing finger and a laugh like gravel, spoke up. "You and that dog, you're walking proof of why we don't leave anyone behind." The others nodded. That Sunday, someone pinned a printed photo of Luke and Ranger walking, taken from behind through the hospital hallway, onto the bulletin board in the town's grocery store. A handwritten caption below read, "Some battles are silent. some victories have pause. Over the next week, more people greeted Luke as he passed. A kid on a skateboard stopped just to say, "Hey, that's the dog from the photo." An elderly woman at the post office gave him a muffin wrapped in wax paper. Even the barista at the cafe near the hospital started keeping a bowl of water outside for Ranger. Ranger walked with Luke everywhere, one step behind or beside. He never pulled, never rushed. It was as if he sensed the weight of each footfall, not just in Luke's legs, but in his spirit. He had once been trained to detect bombs, to rush into fire. Now, he helped Luke rebuild trust in each patch of solid ground. And though Luke still carried the war and the scars along his spine, Ranger reminded him step by quiet step that forward was still an option. The sky over Missoula was a clear, unbroken blue crisp with early autumn and warm in the way only mountain towns could manage at the end of September. Leaves along the edge of the town square had begun to curl and fade to amber. The breeze carried the scent of wood smoke, apples, and dry pine. It was the kind of morning made for beginnings or endings, or perhaps something gently in between. In the center of the park, a simple wooden stage had been set up on the field just beyond the war memorial. Nothing grand, no brass band, just folding chairs arranged in neat rows, a few flags stirring in the wind, and a podium with a hand-painted sign in front that read, "Veterans' Voices, the Courage to Heal." The event was part of a local effort to recognize recovery, not just medals earned in combat, but the invisible victories won afterward. Luke Morgan sat at the edge of the front row, his cane resting lightly between his knees. His hands were steady. His suit, borrowed from Thomas Dyer and tailored by Mrs. Halverson's niece, fit snug around shoulders that had grown stronger. His hair was trimmed, his beard clean. And next to him, as always, sat Ranger. The dog's coat gleamed, and his ears twitched with the low murmurs of the crowd. No leash, no command needed. Ranger knew where he belonged. Olivia Hart stood nearby, chatting quietly with a few hospital staff who had come to support. She wore a simple navy dress and her ever-present calm. When she caught Luke's glance, she gave a nod, silent encouragement from someone who had seen every slow, painful inch of his journey. Gloria and Eli were seated near the back. Eli wore a shirt with a hand-drawn cartoon of Ranger on it, cape and all. Sarah Blake, in a crisp denim jacket and boots that had seen both grief and growth, waved gently from beside them. Dean Tisdale stood near the flagpole with his arms crossed, quietly proud. Around them, townsfolk filled the chairs. Some were veterans. Some were friends. Some just came because they'd heard there was something worth seeing. A microphone buzzed to life. Thomas Dyer shuffled to the podium, his vet cap slightly crooked and his voice gravel-soft. "This morning, we honor the courage to walk again, not just with legs, but with will, not just through pain, but through the kind of silence that most folks never hear." He glanced toward Luke. Some men come home with scars. Some don't come home at all, but every now and then, we meet someone who finds a way back, even when the map's been burned and the road has disappeared. He stepped aside. Luke rose slowly, gripping the cane with one hand, the edge of the chair with the other. The crowd watched as he straightened. His body no longer bent by fear, his gaze no longer cast downward. He stepped forward, one step, two, then climbed the 3 small stairs onto the stage alone, without rails. The wind tugged at his blazer. He reached the podium and exhaled, steady, then spoke. "I spent 12 years thinking I'd already died," he began, voice low but firm. "My body made it home, but something inside me didn't. I shut the door, I locked it, and I threw away the key." He paused, his eyes searching the faces below. But one day, something scratched at the door. He looked to Ranger, who sat at the foot of the stage, tail still, ears forward. It wasn't a therapist. It wasn't a doctor. It wasn't even a human voice. He took a breath. It was a dog, a fellow soldier, discarded by the system just like I had been. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't tell me to be strong. He just sat with me, quietly, as if to say, You're still in there, Luke. I see you." Somewhere in the crowd, someone sniffled. Luke reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a circular bronze medallion, modest, unpolished, engraved with the words, "Healer in Silence." He knelt slowly, painfully, and opened the box before Ranger. Then, with trembling hands, clipped the metal gently onto the dog's collar. The crowd held its breath. Ranger didn't move, just looked into Luke's eyes. "You didn't just save my life," Luke whispered, audible through the mic. "You reminded me I still had one." He stood again, slower this time, and turned back to the podium. "I don't have words big enough to explain what healing looks like," he said. "But I can tell you this, it doesn't always come from hospitals, or speeches, or medals." He looked toward Olivia, then toward Eli, Gloria, Sarah, and Dean. "Sometimes, healing walks beside you. Quiet, watchful, unrelenting. And if you're lucky, if you're very lucky, it doesn't give up on you, even when you've already given up on yourself." He stepped back. The crowd stood. No one cheered at first, just silence, heavy and reverent. Then one person clapped, then another. Then a wave of applause rose, not explosive but deep and warm, as if the entire field had exhaled at once. Luke stepped down from the stage. Ranger walked beside him, their steps perfectly aligned. Someone snapped a photo just as the two crossed the edge of the grass, the man in black, the dog in gold, moving forward not for glory, but because they could. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come wrapped in thunder or light. They arrive on quiet pause in the form of unwavering loyalty and silent love. Luke had every reason to give up, but God sent him a healer who didn't speak, didn't judge, and never walked away. Ranger was not just a dog. He was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of our pain, we are never truly alone. Maybe you're watching this today feeling broken, tired, or forgotten. But just like Luke, healing may already be making its way to your door through a person, a memory, a second chance, or even a four-legged angel. In our everyday lives, we often overlook the soft miracles, the ones that come not to fix us, but to remind us we are still worth saving. And sometimes those miracles carry fur, scars, and stories of their own. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe that God still sends His angels in unexpected forms, type Amen in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more true stories of faith and healing, and may God bless you and all those you love.